In this video, I want to discuss the critical importance of cognitive matching to performance. In a previous video, we discussed what is important to us in achieving performance, and that's essentially seeing both a technical skill and a non-technical skill match between an individual, their specific work, their specific manager, their team, and within their specific organizational culture. So we believe that superior performance will be sustained over time only when there's a match in both the technical and the non-technical sides. When we talk about technical skills, we're referring to educational requirements, specific technical knowledge, and relevant industry experience, all of which are going to be important for the person to have performance success. On the non-technical side, what we do is we divide it into a number of personality-related characteristics, well, categories actually, in which there's a number of various characteristics. And for us, those key categories would be cognitive capability, motivation, concentration, thinking preferences, productivity traits, communication skills, interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence, all of which would create a foundation of non-technical performance. And then if it's a managerial position, we'll look at a number of managerial categories and subsequent characteristics. And if it's a leadership position or there's a key leadership component, we'll look at a number of leadership characteristics and or categories and characteristics as well. The important thing is that in all of those non-technical categories and in relation to the technical as well, a key component of performance is a cognitive match between the person's capabilities and the requirements of the position. And that when there is not a cognitive match, a specific match, performance will just not occur. And it doesn't matter the educational matching that is experienced, nor the non-technical. Cognitive has to be there first. All of the other components are important, but we need to make sure that there's a cognitive match first. When there isn't, what will happen is if a person's capability is below what's required of their position, they'll be overwhelmed and they won't be able to perform. If their capability is above what's required of their position, what we can see is one of two things happening. Either if the person doesn't have additional performance-related characteristics, specifically motivation and a career orientation, those types of things, they are the type that tend to float and tend to protect themselves and aren't necessarily high performers. And if they're not held accountable, they're allowed to get away with it. Whereas when a high-performing, career-oriented person is bored and above their capability requirements of their position, they're going to look for more challenging opportunities elsewhere. So it's very important that an accurate match occur, otherwise we can see performance decline on either side. When we talk about cognitive capability, what we're really referring to is a person's ability to handle complex information. And it's the series of complex steps that they can plan and think through, which I often will refer to as problem-solving capability. So it's their ability to take all of the elements, all of the influences and activities and evaluate and integrate them and come up with effective solutions to problems. Then when we look at what we call cognitive scope, that really is how far in the future can these people make meaningful and effective detailed plans that involve all of these elements and activities. When we're looking at it from a leadership perspective, we would refer to that as vision. So when people would say, oh, Steve Jobs, he had vision, that's fine, that's a word, but how do you define it? For me, it would be the ability to see fairly far into the future and to analyze, all of the different elements and all of the different societal conditions and components and come up with effective solutions or products and services in order to address them. So from a leadership perspective, if cognitive scope is limited or they don't have the level of scope that is required to see far enough into the future, they won't be able to create their vision and create the plans that are necessary for them to be successful. But that doesn't only apply to leaders, it applies to everybody at every level of the organization. Everybody is faced with increasingly complex situations and problems to resolve, and there's a variety of different time horizons in the future that they have to come up with effective or solutions to their problems. So a cognitive match again is crucial to performance success at whatever level of the organization. So because of that, it's important that we are able to evaluate a person's ability to plan, to strategize, to analyze problems, and to anticipate the consequences of actions that they take relative to their position in the organization. Obviously, the CEO of a large organization has to deal with much more complex issues and situations and plan much farther into the future than the person on the workshop floor. So we need to make sure that our evaluation is relative to their respective position in the organization. Sometimes it helps to refer these concepts to an organizational structure. And this is based on the work of Professor Elliott Jacks, who was a key leader in what's called requisite organization and stratified systems theory. And what Mr. Jacks did was in the largest corporations, so the large multinationals, identified that there was really 8 stratums. He would call them stratums, which is just another way of saying complexity levels. And so in an organization, here's this orange line here represents increasing complexity. So at each level of the organization, the complexity that a person has to cope with and the time horizons in which they have to come up with effective solutions becomes increasingly larger. So in this case, we're looking at the largest organization. Then I know sometimes people will say, well, we're in a flat organizational structure. Forget about titles. I've got some examples here. Forget about titles. Think about it in your organizational structure, your flat structure, that there still is varying levels of complexities within that. And so that's where the theory is most important. In this case, what we've done is I've put in super CEO, corporate CEO level so super is 8, stratum 7 is corporate CEO, executive VPs at 6th stratum, divisional manager at the 5th stratum, 4th stratum is GMs, 3rd stratum is second level managers, 2nd stratum is first level managers, and then frontline staff at the first. And again, this is the largest organizational example. Not all organizations obviously are this size. I mean, we have anywhere from stratum 1 size of organization to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 all the way up. And what we can do then is from comparative purposes say, well, in a smaller organization we have 4 levels. And therefore it's a 4-stratum organization, and while the time horizons for this super CEO is quite extensive, how far in the future they need to plan, in the 4 level the time horizons in which they need to plan are significantly different. So it all relates to organizational size and the complexity that will come, increasing complexity that will come with larger organizational structures. What does not change to a certain degree is the time horizons, and I've written them here at a front level, typical front level organization, regardless of size. We'll see a time horizon of planning and effective solutions to be in the 1 month to 3 month range. Stratum 2, 3 month to 1 year planning. Stratum 3, 1 to 2 years. Stratum 4, 2 to 5 years. Stratum 5, 5 to 10 years, stratum 6, 10 to 20 years, stratum 7, 20 to 50 years, and stratum 8, 50 plus years. So in addition to seeing increasing complexity as we go up the ladder, we can also see very significant increasing time horizons that people have to, at whatever level that they're at, have to be able to come up with effective solutions to fulfill. Now, just because we have a person in a super CEO position doesn't mean they're functioning there. So optimally, we would like to see them having that very significant time horizon that they can deal with these complex issues. But just because they're there at any level of this chart doesn't mean they're actually performing at that level. That's what we would want to see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are. So again, various complexity, time horizons that people need to plan through, and that's a key ingredient in making sure when we're slotting people into roles, not only the complexity of the roles, but how far ahead in the future that they can plan to be successful. When we're looking at this as well, the impact of poor performance and impact of mistakes made, as well as the complexity increasing as we go up the charts, the impact of poor decisions and the impact of poor performance increases as you go up as well. So if we have somebody at the lower levels that makes a mistake, it's not as noticeable as when a super CEO or a GM makes a mistake as well. Irregardless, performance is critical at all levels of the organization, and we should be doing the best that we can to put the right type of people in the organizations based on their cognitive capability to function there. So this has, before I get into that, I should also mention, I've created a dividing line here. Many organizations are in this size. I mean, they're not all super multinationals. And so we deal with organizations here. And what we see is that in the lower stratums in a multinational, the lower stratums is more operational and focused on management, whereas the upper stratums are going to be more leadership focused. Now, we always want to see leaders sprinkled throughout. There's no doubt about it, and we want to develop them and help them to move up. But in this example, it becomes critically important that the people at the highest levels are leaders rather than managers. So the need for leadership capability increases significantly. Again, it's not as noticeable if we don't have leaders at this level. We want to have them, but it's not as impactful if we don't have them, where it's very impactful there. But the problem then becomes is when most organizations are in this size, we tend to have conflicting requirements for both management and leadership. And that's where we're dealing with people here regarding what is a priority at your role in your specific organization. Should you be developing more of a managerial capability, or should you be developing more of a leadership capability? Because what happens is in the lower stratums, there tends to be an operational focus and on profitability and productivity and those types of things. So it's an internal focus, whereas as we move up into higher levels in our whatever respective organizations, we tend to see more of an external focus. How do we place our organization in the world becomes more of planning externally rather than a planning internally focus. Along with that, what we also see is in thinking patterns more of a concrete thinking preference at the lower levels. People are more focused on reality and the dollars and cents and the nuts and bolts and what's really happening, rather than externally looking, but also planning the future. So when we start to say, well, what should the leaders with an external orientation be doing? Well, they're creating vision as to where we can go. So this group is thinking more of the realities. This group is thinking more about the possibilities and where we can go. Now, they're both important, and there has to be a combined understanding of the vision and how this comes into the vision, and the vision being realistic based on where we are at this point in time. And this is where it becomes very important that the higher level leadership be able to properly communicate the vision in terms that the lower level more concrete thinking people will understand, embrace, and then become effective followers. So when we think about the benefits of this type of approach, and it really applies to every service that we provide, because again, everything that we do, whether it's leadership development, management development, recruitment services, helping organizations with succession planning, performance enhancement, or career development, career coaching, whatever, it's all performance related. And since cognitive is a key issue for us related to performance, this cognitive awareness and integrating it into our CAES's business practices is a distinguishing feature of the way that we work. So as recruiters or whatever service we're providing, cognitive is always an element because performance is always an element as well. So for example, from the hiring function, if we're looking at any level and saying, okay, we're going to help this client to recruit and hire the right type of person, we need to be able to go in and say, okay, what are the cognitive requirements? What are the total performance requirements of the role? But what are the cognitive requirements of the role in order to find somebody who's going to be successful? You don't want to hire somebody who's not going to perform because their cognitive capabilities are below or above the positional requirements. So it's a key thing for us to be able to identify exactly that cognitive match that's going to be necessary for success. But that also is an impact in individual performance development. I mean, so we're saying, well, we'd like to help this person perform and or not just perform better in whatever role that they're assuming. If they don't have the cognitive capability to perform in that role, there's nothing you can do. There's no educational program or no skill development initiative that's going to help them perform. So you're wasting developmental dollars by spending them on somebody that doesn't have the cognitive capabilities to perform anyways. So similarly, if we're looking at leadership development, we'll say, well, if we want to develop a team, we've got a group that we want to develop the leadership skill set. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all performing at the same levels, and it doesn't necessarily mean that even though they're at that level, that they have the cognitive capability to perform. So again, in that case, if they don't have it, you're wasting your developmental dollars. I mean, the ones who should be in the room will obviously benefit from that, but the ones who don't have the cognitive capability, they're just not going to be able to function anyways. Similarly, from succession planning, if we start to say, well, in this group, we want to say, well, who's going to possibly be able to move into first level management? You need to identify the most likelies in that group based on cognitive, not on experience or anything else. I mean, there's a perfect example is moving somebody from a sales position into a sales manager's position. Quite often the skill sets are different, but a key component of those different skill sets is the complexity and the time horizon that the sales manager has to think about as compared to the salesperson. So leadership development, performance enhancement, retention programs, all of that type of work is dependent on first determining are we really looking at the right people in the right way, or else are we wasting our time because we're not going to get the performance that we need. In that whole approach then, it's one of the key things that results, I should say, is that's a very good way to identify high potentials, because if you've got somebody in that role who is above that capability, you need to make a decision. Is this person important to keep with this team or with this organization? And what are the things that we can do to keep them? How can we challenge them? How can we give them things that they need to stay? Because if they don't, as I mentioned before, people come and go on the basis of management. And if one level isn't adding value to the level before, and if that high potential isn't getting developed and challenged and the opportunity to grow, they're going to find a place that they can. So it's very important from top to bottom to have appropriate capability, not only bringing in people in the door, but people in current positions, because if your managers don't know how to evaluate current people or external new hires, how can they be sure that they're bringing in somebody who can perform? And similarly, HR people, how will they be able to determine when they're hiring or helping in the hiring decision making whether this person's going to be able to come in and perform if they can't understand this concept of cognitive matching? And this is where a lot of poor hiring practices the result of poor hiring practices, and so we then have poor performing managers in making those decisions that just perpetuates a culture of poor performance, or departmental culture of poor performance as well. So it's very important for us to be able to evaluate the performance, cognitive performance capability requirements of a role, and then that of a person. And again, this is where this type of formula helps in the evaluation, because when we know that each stratum is increasingly complex, and we know the time horizons that somebody would have to work at or work within, then we can have a suitable comparative model via which we can look at our candidates and say, can this person come in? Similarly, from a promotion standpoint, we need to know that the person at one level has a cognitive capability to move up to the next. And so not only from the standpoint of evaluating from a structural standpoint and how to determine what's required in the position, it becomes very challenging to determine the cognitive capability of the person that we're evaluating, either from a succession standpoint, promotion standpoint, or a new hire. And unfortunately, what happens is it's very difficult to evaluate cognitive capability. As many of you know, we do a lot of assessment and evaluation work on soft skills. And it would certainly help me if there was a form or a questionnaire that we could put somebody through. And we've tried it and it just doesn't work. The evaluation process really has to be where you take somebody through a question and a path of questions to determine the complexity that they can handle at this current time. And so there's no one method of doing that. It's a question and response process via which then we can say, at this point in time, this person has this level of complexity, and then we compare it to the level of complexity that's required to be successful in the role. Once we know that, or we assume that level of complexity, we can look back through past history and we can see hopefully a growth in the complexity and the time horizons in which they were working in that builds up. Because what we do know is that from a growth standpoint, people's complexity grows over time. And what happens is that they'll start off in late adolescence, and their complexity will grow, and it's like a curve, and in later years it starts to tail off a little bit. But we know that people's complexity grows. And so, for example, Mr. Jobs, unfortunately for me, would start in late adolescence at a higher level of complexity than mine. And while we both would grow, I could never catch Mr. Jobs. I accept that. What's important to understand there is that's how you identify those high potentials. In that, if we have a group of people at a certain level, at a certain age, whatever age, in their careers, but a certain level in age, it's that person that sticks out, that has higher capability and will grow that capability higher than other people as they go along. Again, this has significant impact on our various services, because a lot of times, for example, in the recruitment function, clients are asking me to not only hire somebody or help them to hire somebody at a certain level, but to be able to eventually assume the next level at some period of time. The boss is leaving or moving on to another position or whatever. And so a lot of people just say, oh, sure, they'll be ready in 3 years or 5 years or whatever. But based on this formula and understanding the growth, and by being able to look at the past and chart a growth pattern, we can reasonably say that within such and such a time frame, this person will be ready to take the next level. Similarly, when we're thinking from a retention standpoint, a value standpoint for management, and again, people come and go on the basis of management, assuming that they didn't come in at a similar level than the manager at the beginning, and so not find value from working with that manager, if they grow, they're effectively growing themselves out of that role. And so that manager's responsibility, as this person's capability grows, is to provide them with more challenges and opportunities to address that. And again, if their capability grows and they're not provided with the opportunities that they need, they're going to go elsewhere. So throughout, the growth component of cognitive is influential to, again, leadership development, management development, succession planning, recruitment and evaluation, the identification of high potentials. Pretty well, every developmental program, pretty well a significant part of that performance component as it is in identifying the right match from the outset. I should say that while it would be nice, we cannot accelerate people's growth. over time. And while I mentioned that there's 8 characteristic or 8 Strattons based on Jacks' model, they actually also identify high, medium, and low. So there's actually 24 within that. And that said, so any growth initiatives to help accelerate a person's capability will likely only move them slightly up from maybe Stratum 7 low to a Stratum 7 medium, for example. Very, very difficult. And Jack certainly didn't believe that you could grow it at all, but very difficult to jump from major Stratum from a 6 to a 7 or whatever. Again, key points to sum up. It's very important that people understand that there's a direct relationship between cognitive capability and a person's performance, and it's crucial that an exact match, complexity match, exists between that person and their position, no higher or no less. Cognitive capability enables us to solve problems, and really our working lives is, that's what we do in our working lives. So the ability to solve problems is, again, a key component of performance. Cognitive scope is how far into the future people can come up with effective solutions to the problems that they face in their working life. And of course, the scope requirements will increase as you move higher complexity levels within an organization. The negative impact of a cognitive mismatch not only affects a person in that position, but it'll affect the performance of the direct reports below that person. It'll also impact organizational-wide performance. So again, it's important to make sure that everybody has an appropriate match to the work that they're doing and the requirements of their job. There's no quick solutions to assessing people's cognitive capability. It's a complicated matter, but it's very, very important that we find ways to evaluate that and make sure that we're accurate in our assessment. Otherwise, all of our performance-related practices, whether it's hiring or developmental activities, and leadership management, development, performance enhancement activities, rely on luck rather than trying to ensure that we're making the right decisions and spending the money in the right way. And let's not forget that another component of identifying future potentials and identifying people that we want to retain in the organization, you have to consider that their capability is growing. And so by ensuring that in their position or moving them into next level positions, by doing that, you're going to create a greater retention of the type of people that you need. And the overall result of that is not only individual growth and departmental growth, but organization-wide growth. So I hope that you found this of value, and certainly there's articles in my blog and on our LinkedIn page, and our website as well, that talk about problem-solving capability and cognitive matching. Feel free to access them as well, and I thank you for listening.